Hello, I'm Philip Chase. Welcome to my YouTube channel on the best of fantasy. Today's video is a review of Stormfront by Jim Butcher, which is, of course, the first book in the Dresden Files. Now, I found this to be an entertaining urban fantasy. It's lighthearted with some grit and a bit of melancholy. It's a quick-paced, really nice change from the epic fantasy that I usually read. And it's also delightfully self-mocking, deliberately pulpy, and derivative of detective fiction, crime fiction, that sort of thing. So it often parodies and even subverts the tropes that it uses from crime fiction. And it also features some really wonderful humor, a good deal of whimsy as well, with things like pizza-loving fairies. I want to start right off the bat with a criticism that I have heard more than once, and that is that this book features a bit of objectification and sexualizing of women, male gaze, if you will. And that is a criticism, if you've watched some of my other videos, that I would take very seriously. However, in this case, I do want to offer a kind of, gentle counter-argument, or at least add perhaps a little bit of nuance to this particular critique. And I certainly do invite your comments if this is an issue of representation that is important to you. So let's begin with the narrative style. It is, of course, a first-person narrative in the tradition of crime fiction. And our protagonist and teller of the story is Harry Dresden, wizard for hire, also someone that the Chicago police calls in to deal with the supernatural crimes, those involving magic and supernatural beings. And he's viewed with a fair amount of skepticism, even by those who call upon his aid, if not scorn. His voice is often self-deprecating and self-doubting, and this is one way in which I find Butcher subverts the usual trope of the kind of macho detective. And for a relatively young man, though, Harry Dresden is a little bit old-fashioned in terms of he's a bit chivalrous, if you will, and also his relationship with technology is actually quite fraught. And that has a lot to do with him being a wizard. Also, I think it's probably a quirk of his personality. And he is a wizard whose status and reputation are somewhat stained in the magical world by events that were out of his control, tragic events from his past. One of the great things about the character is that Butcher reveals his history in little bits, skillfully woven into the narrative. Harry is essentially decent and kind, and he really tries to do the right thing, even though sometimes he is tempted to use power to get what he wants. But he'll do the right thing even when it hurts him. Also, he seems to have had a really disastrous romantic life, and this is partly because he's a wizard, also partly because of circumstances beyond his control, and partly because he's pretty clueless. In fact, the talking skull that lives in his basement, Bob, seems to know a lot more about romance than poor Harry. So this brings us to the views and descriptions of women in the narrative and the relationships as well. Now, there are a lot of physical descriptions of women characters in here, but that's true of all characters, in fact. And I think this is a bit of a trope in detective fiction. I'm not that well read in detective fiction, but I believe what Butcher is doing here is kind of a nod to detective fiction, where every time we meet a new important character, we get a pretty thorough physical description. That applies to everyone in the story. One of the most important relationships that Harry has in the story is that with Lieutenant Murphy. Now, she's an interesting character, and Harry values her as a friend and as a person. In fact, he kind of mocks his own attempts to be chivalrous with her. For example, the race to the door because he wants to open it for her and she doesn't want him to open it for her. And it's become a kind of cute competition between the two of them. But the fact is, Harry is aware of this character's strength, that Lieutenant Murphy is in fact a very strong woman. In fact, he realizes that she's stronger than he is, and that's one of the things that he clearly admires her for, and he wants her approval. Another female character that I have a feeling is going to be important in the series is Susan Rodriguez, the reporter. Now, it's clear here that Harry has a crush on Susan, and there seems to be maybe even some genuine chemistry going on there, although also Harry seems to be aware that she's trying to always get a story out of him, and she always seems to get the better of him as well. He feels basically outwitted and outclassed around Susan. And in fact, one of the more memorable scenes, simultaneously comical and life-threatening, is one with Harry and Susan. And it's Harry that is the one who ends up the most exposed in that scene, if you will, and you'll know what I mean when you get there. And then there's Bianca the vampire. Now, there is no doubt that this character is sexualized. She is a femme fatale, once again, in the tradition of the detective crime fiction. But I think it should be acknowledged that vampires, for their entire history, have been a combination of Eros and Thanos, of lust and decay, attraction and repulsion. So Bianca certainly fits in that tradition as well. And there's also much more to her than that veneer. And Harry certainly feels a great deal of guilt for, at one point, exposing her as a vampire. And he feels what seems to be, even though he's afraid of her, some sympathy for her. So even that's a little bit complex. There are also women in the sex industry portrayed in the book. Most important among them is probably Linda Randall. And this is a character who is, in fact, somewhat humanized, much more than sex workers typically are in narratives, whether they be films or books. And it's also true that I think to some degree we do hear Linda Randall's voice in the story. Harry is a bit attracted to her, but also he connects to her as a person. So I think it's more complex than simple creepy male gaze here. Harry is, for the most part, baffled by women, with a mix of longing and resignation. In fact, Harry in general is full of doubts and guilt and even some self-loathing, but he's got a good heart. And I think that he's a pretty thoroughly sketched character because we're in his head for the whole narrative. And also engaging. He's a character that I found myself definitely pulling for. And there are enough skeletons in his closet also to make him pretty interesting. He's got a checkered history. And he's a loner, but again, not a creepy one. He's gentle and I would say relatable as he struggles to do the right thing. Other characters in the book are honestly a bit more flat, although I do see some hints of some really great potential in development of characters like Lieutenant Murphy and perhaps Susan Rodriguez. I'm guessing that these are going to be recurring characters in the series. So to sum it up, I think this is a really great series from what I've seen so far. I'm very interested to see where it goes, and I'll definitely be continuing with it. And I also think it's a wonderful series that you kind of can come back to every now and again, maybe after reading some epic fantasy to give yourself a break. Each book seems to be self-contained with a complete arc, so that's kind of nice. You don't have to read all of them at once. Some things I'd love to see some more of as I continue later on in the series would be more of the magic. It seems pretty interesting. There's a lot of drawing from energy and emotion and that sort of thing. I'd also love to see more of the Never Never, more of the fairies and the vampires and the other creatures who seem to live side by side with the rest of us, unbeknownst to most of us. And there's the White Council. So I'd like to see the series. I'm sure it's going to go there, delve into more of that sort of thing. Very promising start, very interesting and fun. Mostly just a fun book, pretty lighthearted. And also, most fans who talk about the series say that it really improves after the first few books. So, hey, if it goes up from here, I'm all for it. Next week, I'm going to be returning to some epic fantasy, actually, and a little bit of grimdark, actually. It's Joe Abercrombie's first book in his new trilogy, A Little Hatred. And the second book in that trilogy is going to be coming out soon, so I'm getting myself ready for that. And so I hope you will join me for that video. I'm also planning to do a little something extra maybe next week. Other than my regularly scheduled review, I am going to maybe do a little something about the history, the origins of fantasy. So I hope those of you interested in that sort of topic will join me. And if you're interested in fantasy in general, please consider liking and subscribing. And I hope to see you again. Till next time.